All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the very first episode of Australian Economics. I am the Aussie AnCap, and I'm here today with the one and only Arabian Pleb. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, mate. How are you?
Oh yeah, not too bad. Same old, same old. Obviously, both of us are Australian, living in this pandemic, in this lockdown at the moment. So we figured we'd start a bit of a podcast, just talk about liberty from an Australian perspective, talk a bit about Austrian economics and libertarianism in the Rothbardian tradition, I suppose. So I guess we'll just crack into it because there's nothing else really to do. Why don't you give us a bit of an overview of where you're coming from, Arabian, and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, sure, mate. So I've grown up in a small country town, and like I don't know, like a lot of the people that I grew up with and mixed with are pretty left wing, I guess. Like it's a pretty sort of lefty area. It is a bit of a weird mix, actually. We do have a lot of rednecks and things like that, country boys and stuff. But then we've also got like a big hippie sort of leaning group of people, and yeah, so yeah, man. How I came to libertarianism was actually through Austrian economics and just finding some videos online, in particular Peter Schiff. I was listening to a lot of Joe Rogan at the time, and then stumbled across Peter Schiff, and he really just shattered my whole worldview, man, and opened my eyes to Austrian economics, and really gave me. It was the only thing that I had ever heard, only school of thought I'd ever heard that actually gave real answers to a lot of the real issues that we face today.
Yeah, look, that actually makes complete sense. I came from a slightly different perspective, I guess. I started off, I was always, I guess, kind of apolitical. Like I didn't really have any strong political opinions. And so one day I took the political compass test, and it kind of put me as like a very moderate libertarian right, like super moderate, like probably more of a centrist, but slightly leaning in that direction. So I got kind of interested. Okay, if I'm going to be a libertarian, a right-wing libertarian, what does that actually mean? So I started looking around on YouTube, on online and whatnot, and I came across some people discussing AnCaps. I didn't know what AnCaps were, but they were basically saying how crazy they were and how insane their ideology was. And I was like, well, they must be doing something right if people are talking smack about them so much online. So I Googled AnCap, and it came up with anarcho-capitalism. I was like, well, that sounds pretty radical. So from there, look, after that, I was kind of just down the rabbit hole. I watched a few YouTube videos. I got introduced to like Murray Rothbard, all the grades, Hans Hermann Hopper, you name it, Bob Murphy in the present day. And from there, it was just a one-way street. Just couldn't claw myself back out of it. Once you're in, you're kind of hooked. So I started off learning about libertarian theory, I guess the philosophy element of it. And then that introduced me to the economics, Austrian economics, Rothbard, Mises, all those guys. I got reading about them, and what they said made complete sense to me. And it gave me a kind of a different perspective on economics, because I'd always kind of thought of economics as, maths and equations, and they kind of introduced a new perspective, how to look at it, and it all made complete sense to me. So yeah, like I said, it's kind of a one-way street. Once you put yourself in the rabbit hole, it's very difficult to get yourself out of it.
100%, 100% Aussie, and yeah, man. For me, when Peter Schiff would explain Austrian economics, it was just like, how do I explain it? It like removed a lot of the smoke and mirrors from, like I would try and listen to, I don't know, like say like ABC Business and make sense of what they were talking about when they would refer to different economic methodology and GDP and inflation and all these things, but like they would talk about inflation like as if it was a good thing, and to do associating with wage growth and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, when Peter Schiff really just broke down like the definition of inflation, the expansion of the money supply, and how that just affects everything, and central banking, like that just really removed the smoke and mirrors, and it just it is the truth, and just it makes so much sense.
Yeah, and I guess we should kind of, if I don't know who's going to be our audience, but if people are watching this or listening to this and they're not aware of what libertarian is, or they're not really understanding what we're talking about, I guess it'd be a good idea to kind of break down what exactly it is we're talking about. So libertarianism in our tradition, in the Rothbardian tradition, is essentially a radical version of like classical liberalism. So like, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, those kind of characters that kind of talks about natural rights and kind of expanded on this idea of how the role of government should be limited. So they were kind of opposed to the idea that you could justify like the state controlling all aspects of people's lives, and that people should just give away their rights to the state to ensure security. And they kind of had different conceptualization of that. And they said, no, the role of government should be to protect the rights of their citizens. And then that transitioned on to Mises and guys in kind of the more, I guess, the libertarian movement, but they weren't fully anarchists, and they still supported the existence of a state on the grounds that you needed one to protect property rights. But then along came a guy by the name of Murray Rothbard, and he said, no, if anything, the state is the biggest violator of property rights just by existing, because to exist, it needs to infringe on property rights by levying taxes to pay for the stuff that it provides its citizens. So he said, no, you could, in fact, have a society that was completely free and respected property rights fully by abolishing the state, but maintaining customs and laws and rules about people and their relationship to property that could be enforced without a state. So I guess if you had to distill libertarianism and our entire philosophy into one word, it would be property rights. People have a right to the products of their labor, not in the socialist sense, but in the sense that when property comes into existence when someone, to use the Lockean term, mixes their labor with a natural resource, right? And once that happens, that becomes their property. And because they've changed that natural resource to suit their own ends, and at that point, their labor is embodied in that product, not in a Marxist sense. Again, in our sense of the word, it just means that you've changed nature to suit your ends, and your labor is forever embodied in that product, so that if someone were to take it from you, they've essentially stolen from you. They've taken your labor and your time and your resources by force. So yeah, that's kind of the justification for libertarianism. Is there anything kind of you wanted to add on to that at all?
Yeah, man. No, that dude, you are so impressive, Aussie. Like, for the listeners out there, like, this young man is 21 years old, and dude, you just hit the nail on the head. Like, you have just described libertarianism and the whole philosophy perfectly. So, man, yeah, like, good on you, mate. You're really inspiring, man. And the only thing I would add is the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Yeah, so libertarianism is property rights, like you just said, and coupled with the NAP, the non-aggression principle, which is basically the fact, like, we believe that we own our own bodies, and we have the greatest claim to our bodies, and no one has a right to infringe, to initiate violence against another peaceful person.
Exactly. 100% right. And, a lot of people, when they're kind of reading about anarcho-capitalism early on, they say, AnCaps just think that, we should believe in the non-aggression principle and then society will work out. And it's kind of frustrating to me because at the end of the day, the non-aggression principle is a principle. It's in the name. And it's just supposed to be like an underlying assumption and idea about the way that we should operate within society and the way that a just society works. It's not an enforcement mechanism. It's not a law. it's like it's kind of like the equivalent of saying, the 10 commandments, okay, and saying, well, the 10 commandments are terrible because there's no enforcement mechanism. It's like, no, it's our job to figure out, okay, these are the principles that we believe in. How can we stay true to these principles while living in a good society, in a just society? So in that sense, you're right. The non-aggression principle is foundational to libertarianism and to our philosophy. But people kind of get that mixed up with, there's actually methods that we've kind of talked about and discussed about how that can be enforced. I think that's really important for people to understand, is that, we don't just kind of say, oh, the non-aggression principle, no coercion, and then just leave it at that and just assume that that's how society is going to work out. But like you said, 100% right. The non-aggression principle is so important to how we understand libertarianism, how we want a society to be conducted without force. And we believe that it is possible to have a society where people are left alone when they want to be left alone, and they're only engage in transactions and in interactions that are completely voluntary. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to justify coercion, you can justify all kinds of heinous acts and crimes which the state commits routinely.
100%, exactly right.
And I guess on that as well, I guess we should also, we've kind of touched on Austrian economics briefly, but I think we should kind of delve into it more a little bit. So when you hear the word Austrian economics, what is it that you think of, Arabian?
Well, to be honest, Aussie, it kind of frustrates me that we have to like define it as Austrian economics, and I get it, because and I think like Bob Murphy sort of makes this point, is that we kind of have to be able to differentiate like our school of thought from all the other economic schools of thought. But in my eyes, man, it is just the true economics. Like no other school of thought actually accounts for all the interactions and human action that just happens throughout the world. But yeah, man, I suppose like Austrian economics is, I'd say, and there's a few points, but I'd say like one of the fundamental things is the focus around sound money and the role that the entrepreneur plays in the economy.
Very good point.
And yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, if you want to elaborate on that more. Oh, well, I think you'd probably be better at really getting into the details of it. So I'll try and tag on wherever I can.
So for me, the fundamental aspect of Austrian economics that separates it from any other school of thought or mainstream economics in general is praxeology.
Yes.
So praxeology is what Mises called the science of human action. And what it essentially is we start with the premise, the axiom that humans act, and they act in the pursuit of goals, right? And the reason that's an axiom is Rothbard pointed out that a statement arises to the status of an axiom when, even in the process of trying to refute it, you reaffirm it, if you know what I mean. So if someone tried to set out to dispute the idea that humans act, by the very nature of attempting to refute it, they have reaffirmed it by acting in the attempt to refute it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's an unfalsifiable, necessarily true statement that humans act. So if something is true, any premises that you derive from that statement must necessarily also be true. So if A means B, or if A implies B and A is true, that means B is true, right? So what Austrians say is that economic truth, because of the fundamental fact of human action, the fundamental truth of human action, we can derive economic truth from that axiom, right? So the concepts like supply and demand, comparative advantage, opportunity cost, bunch of other concepts that you can name, all of those can be traced all the way back and then through a series of deductions reached from the fundamental necessary truth that humans act, and they act in the pursuit of goals. And there's a bunch of other axioms that go along with it, like that humans differ, we vary, we have variance between ourselves. That's necessarily true and unfalsifiable. there is the fact that actions take up time. So what that means is that we have a limited, our actions are necessarily limited and scarce by the very fact that they take up time, and we are not immortal, right? So we have a set amount of time on this earth. So any action that we take necessarily means that there are other actions that we cannot take because we've used up that time to do that one action. And that's how all those things can then be traced towards concepts like comparative advantage, opportunity cost, like I said, like I named them off before, supply and demand, right? They're all necessarily true because we started with the axiom of human action and then derived them from that axiom.
Yeah. Beautiful. And irrefutable, like you said.
Well, exactly. That's the fundamental thing, right? Is that it's not the fundamental axiom that humans act is irrefutable. So the only way that you can disagree with Austrian economics is to show that the conclusions do not derive from the premises, if you get what I mean. So in order to dispute supply and demand for existence, you would have to show, okay, it's not actually true that we can derive, there's some point at which the conclusion is not implied in the premises, if you get what I mean. So if you can't do that, then it's necessarily true. Okay, it's necessarily true that as supply of a good rises, demand, that the intersection of supply and demand is the equilibrium, for instance. That is necessarily true by its very nature. Unless you can show that one of the premises is either wrong or that a conclusion that's been derived from those premises is wrong. But so far, I haven't seen anyone that's been able to do that, at least with supply and demand, that's for sure.
That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah, man, you are so impressive. You really understand this stuff. Yeah, man, it's really, really like it's a massive white pill to hear someone of your age just really get this stuff. And yeah, like it's so necessary that we get this information out and people understand this, especially in this country, in Australia, because there's so much government intervention there in the economy, and you know, like people get blinded by, and the waters get murky, and you know, it's hard for people to really see where private enterprise starts and the state interventions end. Like it's so badly intertwined. And that's the reason for all of our economic woes, like, you know, rampant inflation, rampant you know, house price inflation, and government debt, and just debt amongst all individuals of all kinds. You know, it comes back to these fundamental premises that you're talking about, and the Austrians are the only ones that have an answer for these issues and all these problems.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you raised about we have the answers to the problems, because one of the things that's problematic about the other schools or mainstream economics in general is that they can't make a claim of truth. Okay, if you get what I mean, because they consider economics to be a science. They consider it to be you make a hypothesis, and then you go out and test that hypothesis, and then you derive a conclusion from those tests about whether your hypothesis was accurate or inaccurate. The problem with that when it comes to economics is, or the problem when it comes to truth in relation to that, is that science itself cannot derive cannot prove beyond doubt certain truths, because it only takes one counterexample to falsify a hypothesis, right? So if we might say that, you know, through empirical observation, that if you put two hydrogen atoms with an oxygen atom, you get a molecule of water. Okay, that two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom necessarily make water. Okay, but it only takes one example that shows those three atoms combining to not make water, and suddenly you falsified that idea. Okay, so the point being that mainstream economics wants to use the scientific method to arrive at conclusions. The problem being that when you use empirical evidence to substantiate something, necessarily because by its very nature, empirical research can be falsified. You can't make a truth claim with it. Okay, so when Keynesians say, the government needs to spend during a recession to raise aggregate demand, right? Because during a recession you have lower private spending. So in order to get out of the recession, the government needs to spend more to stimulate the economy to raise aggregate demand, right? That's the Keynesian solution to a bust, like in the boom and bust cycle, which we'll talk about as well. But the problem with that is that conclusion has been derived from empirical research and evidence. But there's no way that you can say that statement is necessarily true, because there have been counterexamples. And it also means that the Keynesians, because they don't have this like understanding of what our understanding of theory is, that it is generally true statements. So supply and demand is generally true. Okay, it doesn't, like, you can find examples where a decrease in supply might not have led to an increase in price, but that can be explained by other factors that aren't supply and demand. But Keynesians, they can't do the same, okay, because they haven't established that their theory is necessarily true because it is derived from empirical evidence. So for me, the biggest advantage that the Austrian School of Economics has is that we can make statements that are true about the world, whereas other schools of thought can't. At least other schools of thought that aren't going to derive their truths from axioms and from deductive logic. And yeah, I mean, look, we can talk about the Austrian business cycle theory. We can talk about practical applications of it. But is there anything else you kind of want to talk about from a theoretical perspective?
No, dude, I think you just said it best, and yeah, I think in terms of the theory side of things, I'm not like as well versed and well read as you are, but like I suppose like I kind of just understand this stuff, and this is the point that, again, like Peter Schiff, which I must say, like I give a lot of credit to Peter Schiff because he admires this stuff, but he does frustrate me being like a minarchist and sort of justifying certain roles that the government plays in society and the economy, which it just to me is batshit crazy.
So he has a love affair with gold, which is a bit problematic as well. I mean, I get it. That's where he gets his money, but it does frustrate me a little bit.
And yeah, no, I agree. And so yeah, so like I just like I really understand this stuff from like a real layman sort of blue collar type perspective. Like and a lot of the theory too, like I get the theory, like it makes sense, but it's and I suppose like the beautiful thing about the Austrian school of thought is like they're explaining just simple things that we do, that everybody does in their life but take for granted, and the Austrians just can like precisely and in such a eloquent way like explain all these things, and it's just beautiful to me. And dude, you've got the magic touch, so yeah, fuck yeah. Ooh,
thanks, mate.
Excuse my language.
No, so I think to tie a bow on it a little bit before we get into any practical discussions, I do just want to quote something that I read from Rothbard. So on praxeology, he says that praxeology rests on the fundamental axiom that individual human beings act. That is, on the primordial fact that individuals engage in conscious actions towards chosen goals. This concept of action contrasts to purely reflexive or knee-jerk behavior, which is not directed towards goals. The praxeological method spins out by verbal deduction the logical implications of that primordial fact. In short, praxeological economics is the structure of logical implications of the fact that humans act. This structure is built on the fundamental axiom of action and has a few subsidiary axioms, such that individuals vary and that human beings regard leisure as a valuable good. Any skeptic about deducing from such simple base an entire system of economics, I refer to Mises as human action. Furthermore, since praxeology begins with a true axiom, A, all propositions that can be deduced from this axiom must also be true. For if A implies B and A is true, then B must also be true. So I think Rothbard, because he's an absolutely brilliant writer, has pretty much summarized that perfectly for me. And so if anyone was a bit confused about that, just look up a bit of Rothbard, get your head around it that way, because he is a brilliant writer, like one of the best political philosophers from a writing perspective, one of the best that I've ever read in non-fiction terms. He is one of a kind. Moving on a little bit.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, and we spoke about this the other day, but for one book that anybody should read of Rothbard's, first and foremost, would be Anatomy of the State. It's 24 pages, and it is just amazing. It's
brilliant. It's the first thing that I read of his before reading The Ethics of Liberty and a little bit of Man, Economy and State. Although that is one that you have to spend a lot of time wrapping your head around because it's very long and it's very dense. But Anatomy of the State is a brilliant work. It's kind of, I liken it to our Communist Manifesto, just in the sense that it's really short, really simple to understand, but still brilliant. But yeah, moving on to practical concerns, I think the biggest one is the Austrian business cycle theory. That to me is the greatest practical exposition of pure Austrian economics that there is, because it's one of the places where other schools of thought just simply haven't got a defined, true method that they always implement the same way to understand how economic recessions occur. But the Austrians do, and they can explain it very well, and it's very easy to understand and easy to follow. So to break it down, essentially what the Austrians argue is that if you have a central bank, and that bank, in order to spur economic growth, what it will do is it will lower interest rates, right? So at the moment in Australia, we have incredibly low interest rates, I think like 0.25% or something
0.1%,
like something ridiculously low like that, right? And what you have to understand about, from the Austrian perspective, what an interest rate is, it reflects the price of money, if you get what I mean. So if the interest rate is 5%, let's say, I wish the interest rate was fucking 5%, but let's say it was, if you have $1,000, or sorry, if you want to, if you have $1,000, and actually no, I'll start again. If you want to borrow $1,000, let's say you want to borrow $1,000, right? And the interest rate is 5%. If you want to borrow $1,000, that means that in 1 year's time, you will have to pay someone back $1,050, if that makes sense. So the price of money is $50 per year if you're borrowing $1,000, or 5% on top of whatever you've initially borrowed. So the interest rate is essentially the price of money. And from the Austrian perspective, the interest rate should, like any price in the economy, right? Because we talk about supply and demand, right? Any price in the economy, if it's going to reflect the true supply and demand, should be roughly equal to the equilibrium of this, like the intersection of supply and demand, right? So the natural interest rate, in other words, should be what the actual interest rate is. So the ratio between what people are willing to borrow and what people are willing to lend, where that intersects should be the natural rate of interest. Okay, but what a central bank comes in and does when it wants to spur economic growth is it artificially lowers the price of money. So people borrow, and by consequence, it encourages borrowing, right? Because money is cheaper to borrow now. And as we know, when you lower the price of something, you increase the demand for it. So what you've done is artificially increased and this is the explicit intention of lowering interest rates. That's what you got to remember. By lowering the price, you have artificially created demand for money that didn't previously exist, which then by consequence encourages, businesses or budding entrepreneurs to borrow money when they otherwise wouldn't have. Okay. And what the Austrians argue is that it actually pushes investment further into the future where it otherwise would have been. So look, it's difficult to illustrate without having like a piece of paper. But Walter Block breaks this down really well. Is say you got a triangle of investment where as you go further on into the future, the rate of investment goes downwards. What lowering interest rates does is it flattens out and pushes out that triangle, right? And all that extra investment into the far future is not based on any real world growth. Okay, that's the point that the Austrians make, is that when you lower interest rates, you create a demand for growth that isn't actually backed up by any real world economic growth through saving and investment. Okay, and then what the Austrians end up arguing is that you have this great big boom because everyone it goes really well for a certain period of time. Everyone borrows all this money, there's all these new businesses springing up, wages go up because there's more competition for labor, prices come down. Okay, everyone's loving it. Okay, consumer confidence is up, everyone's loving it because there's all these new products on sale, wages are going up because there's all these new companies competing for labor. But what happens eventually, the thing about Austrians is we often say we can't exactly predict when this is going to happen. We just know that it will happen and that it's inevitable. Is eventually what happens is generally the banks end up chickening out. Okay, they don't want to pay off these mortgages and these loans, I should say, anymore, or allow people to. So suddenly you get, when the economy takes a downturn, all of a sudden all these people that loaned out money that they can't, all these people that borrowed out money that they can't actually pay back, they default on their loans, okay, because they no longer have, because their prosperity was based on an unsustainable boom in economic activity, right? So when the economy takes a downturn, all these people go, oh, I can't pay off my loan anymore, and they default, they lose their assets. And then we saw this with the housing bubble in 2007. That's a classic example of what the Austrians are talking about. Demand for, all these new houses went on the market when people defaulted on their loans. So supply of housing rose, which means demand for money or demand for housing dropped. Okay. And then what happens is when the demand for housing drops, when the supply of housing rises, you get a decrease in price. Okay. So that's the market crashing. Okay. And suddenly all these banks that have all these CDOs, these, what are they called? Collateralized debt obligations, all these investors that have all their money tied up in housing, when the market takes a downturn, they all want to sell off, okay? Because they've realized, oh, all my investments are going to go up in smoke. I better get rid of them now while I still can. And that's when the market crashes and then everything goes to shit, essentially. So what the Austrians argue is that what is actually happening when we have a bust is that the market is self-correcting back to equilibrium.
Yes.
Okay, right? So the Austrians actually argue that the boom is the bad part. Like all these Keynesians want to say, the boom is the best bit, like the bit where there's all this economic prosperity, people are doing so well, wages are rising, everything's going great. And then the bust is like the shitty downside that we need to kind of alleviate somehow by raising aggregate demand, by having government spending. And the Austrians say, no. The bust is the problem, because the bust is when we're having this artificial growth that isn't actually backed up by any real world economic activity or savings. Okay. And the bust is the market self-correcting and going back to where it should be. Okay. And shortening people's horizons and encouraging investment in closer to the present. Okay. So that's look, I'm not an expert. Okay, so this is probably a really bad explanation, and I'm sure.
No, dude, that was great, mate. No, seriously. And the only thing I would just add one thing is that, like, why this is so insane, right? Like, why the Keynesian school of thought, and these central banks doing these things, creating artificial booms and then an inevitable bust. Why it's so insane is because the natural state of the economy is deflationary. And like, to give an example would be like, I don't know, say like building a house 200 years ago. Like, if you think about how labor intensive that would have been, you know, the amount of manpower, and the primitive tools that they would have been using, you know, like it would have been far more expensive because it was way more inefficient back then, like expensive in real terms, right? But like, so then if you think of today now, like building a house, like we've got like one machine that will just like pluck a tree, you know what I mean, strip the branches, dice it up into planks, and then throw it on the back of a truck in like seconds. And you know, 200 years ago it would have been like, you know, I don't know, 50 men chopping a tree, you know, the time, it just everything. So like, as technology improves, we get more efficient, the price of everything should come down.
Exactly. And it's a very good point. You know, people kind of think that, you know, deflation is inherently bad, but at the end of the day, the market should reflect the attitudes and decisions of people. Okay. And as a result, we should be seeing the price of stuff coming down over time, not going up. What else is there to kind of talk about? I mean, I guess we could talk a bit more about where this kind of comes from. And I guess the big question, or what I'm kind of thinking about talking about, is, I guess, I don't know, have you got any ideas what we should kind of discuss, what we can go with?
Maybe we could talk about like just money, like just the idea, like what is money? And because I think that is a crucial thing for people to understand, and how government has really destroyed our money.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so Austrians understand, or there's kind of this, you know, this idea that money is the invention of the state, right? Money is something that the state imposes, and it literally creates out of thin air. But Austrians kind of understand that that's not where money originated from. Okay, money is something that emerged through daily economic activity. And Bob Murphy, I encourage people to Google him. He is so good when it comes to this stuff. He explains money mechanics. There's actually a YouTube video on it. He says, Robert P. Murphy, money mechanics. Just put that into YouTube, 45-minute video, breaks it down perfectly. But in essence, what he argues is that money emerged from and it dates back, it's not just him, it dates back to Karl Menger, who was like the first, or like the origin of the Austrian School of Economics. And they kind of talk about how money emerged through market transactions when people realized they needed a medium of exchange. Because once goods get more and more complex, okay, let's say you're trying to trade in the 17th century, you're trying to trade a telescope for a horse. Okay, well, how many horses is a telescope worth? Or how many telescopes is a horse worth? We don't know, right? It's not something that you can't trade half a horse. Okay, you can't have a medium. There's not a medium of exchange there, right? You can't exchange like for like. But what happens over time is that these it's difficult for me to kind of fully get my head around, but these resources that people value because of their ability to be exchanged for other resources. So like originally it was precious metals, so like gold, silver, other precious metals. People use those as a medium of exchange because they gain value because of their ability to be used as a medium of exchange, because you could create, I guess, fungible tokens that were of equal value. Okay, so suddenly you didn't have to exchange a telescope for a horse. You could exchange, let's say, a telescope for 15 ounces of gold. Okay, I don't know, 15 ounces of gold, let's say. And then a horse might be worth 10 ounces of gold. So now you can, if you want to trade your telescope for a horse, you trade your telescope for 15 gold ounces, and then you trade 10 of those gold ounces for a horse. Okay, and now you have a horse plus 5 gold ounces. So it gives you a medium of exchange by which, whereas before, it's like if you had one telescope and you wanted a horse, well, you couldn't exchange those, because the other problem is, what if the seller of the horse doesn't want a telescope? Okay, what do you do then? Okay, the probability that you can find someone that wants a telescope is pretty high on the marketplace. The probability that you can find someone that wants a telescope that owns horses is a lot lower. So what you do is you exchange your telescope to someone who wants a telescope in exchange for a medium of exchange that will also be accepted by the person that has the horse. Okay, so the importance of sound money is that, again, money is supposed to represent the ratio between supply and demand. And it's supposed to, I guess, once you kind of manipulate the supply of money and change it, you're manipulating price signals and you're changing people's evaluations of goods that isn't in line with one another. Okay, because the thing about inflation is, a lot of inflation models assume that everyone acknowledges the existence of the new money instantaneously. But that isn't what happens. Like, so let's say you have, let's say at the moment a liter of milk costs $2 or however much it costs, something like that. I think $1 more like. Let's say you double the money supply. Logically speaking, the price of milk will double, right? Because you have twice as much money, but the same number of resources. So the ratio between money and goods has doubled to the side of the money. Therefore, the price of those goods has to double to compensate for that. But that doesn't happen instantaneously. Okay, it happens slowly over time. So people don't think about the fact that there's new money in the economy. They just keep reacting to new price signals. So what you're doing is you're manipulating the economy, and people don't realize that you are. And so their actions do not reflect the fact that there's new money in the economy.
Yeah, that's right. And then there, and what you're getting at is the Cantillon effect, where those that are closest to the creation of new money, who get to spend it first, get the full benefit of the purchasing power before the general public realize
it. Exactly right. Exactly
so,
right.
And that's it, man. Like that's the problem with inflation, and inflation defined as the creation of the expansion of money supply, to inflate. A lot of the misconception out there is that inflation, they just think of prices going up, but no, the Austrians correctly identify inflation as the expansion of the currency supply, and then prices will that's just like an after effect. That's just like a symptom of inflation when prices start to rise. But yeah, the point is that who inflation hurts the most is the most vulnerable people, like the low income earners, the poorest people, and inflation is really a tax. It's a vicious tax.
That's the point that people need to appreciate. Is, so let's say again, let's use my example. Let's say that milk costs $1 a liter. A new car costs $40,000. A new house costs $100,000. I'm obviously using very inaccurate prices here to make my point. House costs a lot more than $100,000 at the moment in Melbourne. And you have a salary of $50,000 a year, and you have $10,000 in savings. Let's just take that as an example. And let's say the government doubles the money supply. And then what will happen is all those prices will double, including your wage. Okay, so taking my examples, now a liter of milk will cost $2. That car will cost $80,000. That house will cost $100,000, and your wage will now be, I think it was $80,000, double of whatever it was. But what hasn't changed is your savings. Your savings are still $100,000. So what you've done is you've doubled the price of everything, including your wage, in other words, you've halved the value of savings.
Yes.
Okay. You've halved the value of all the money that was in people's bank accounts already doesn't get doubled when we inflate the money supply. It stays the same. Okay. So inflation is essentially a tax on savings. And again, it hurts the people at the end of the line the most, and the people at the end of the line are the end consumers, the buyers of the final goods, and those
Yes.
are disproportionately the poorest people in our society. Okay, so your point about inflation being a vicious tax is so true. It's like we talk about, oh, we need progressive taxation, and we need to have the rich paying 40% of the income, but the poor only paying like 0 or 10% of their income to make it a fair society, But if you're going to inflate money, it doesn't matter, because that inflation benefits the upper class, especially the banks, because they get that money first and they get to spend it as if inflation hasn't happened yet, or because it hasn't happened yet, or the price inflation that comes along with the actual inflation, which is the expansion of the money supply, hasn't happened yet. But by the time it goes through the economy and gets to those end consumers, the inflation effect has occurred, and now suddenly their money doesn't buy what it used to buy, or their savings don't buy what they used to buy. So the price for house has gone up, but I haven't got the double. I haven't got that same amount back in savings. So if the interest rate is lower than the inflation rate, if you've got money sitting in your bank account, every year you're losing money if you're not increasing the balance of that bank account. If the rate of inflation is higher than the interest rate you're getting on your bank account, which at the moment it most likely is, right, then you're losing money.
Oh, certainly.
Right? Because the inflation rate is what? Probably like 2 or 3%, something like that. At the moment, like your bank account is probably getting 0.4% interest. Okay. So every year, even though you're technically making money in nominal terms on interest, you're actually losing money if your bank balance is staying the same. Ceteris paribus, what we talk about a lot, ceteris paribus. So yeah, that's a really important point that people need to understand. Inflation is a tax on savings, and it's a tax on the savings of the people who need savings the most.
That's it. That's exactly right. And who it benefits the most is those, like the rich, the wealthy, like those that own assets, because like you said, like when the government creates inflation, and then prices get bid up, well, it's those that own those assets of the price getting bid up that benefit from it. And then anyone who doesn't own anything or just has a small amount of savings in the national currency, they get wiped out. And then that wealth gap that all the like the lefties and progressives like to go on about, like that's what drives the disparity between the rich and the poor the most out of anything, man. And not to say and not to say that like wealth disparity is a bad thing. Like I think, obviously like the Austrians recognize that the entrepreneur or, that is willing to take the risk and invest his capital, should benefit from that. Like that's his private property. That's his right. And then the other thing I think to touch on too, Aussie, is just the fact that when the government spends $1, like that is, that is inflationary. And well, if they're doing it the dishonest way, which most of the time they are, and how like how does a central bank even artificially low interest rates at all? Like in the first place, how it does is by buying government bonds, buying government debt. And but yeah, so like when the government spends money, like that's the real tax. Like that's the main thing that everyone should be focused on, not actually what they're collecting in taxes.
Yeah, that's what Ron Paul pointed out.
Yes.
Yeah, that every dollar the government spends comes from taxation in one way or another. Either it comes from actual tax dollars, so the money that it takes in as revenue, inflation, which is, as we already established, is government is a tax on savings, I should say. That's what inflation is. Or it is paid for by government debt, which is a tax on future earnings.
Yeah.
The end. Every dollar that the government spends has to be taxed to pay for. It's as simple as that. Which means that all these policies about, people talk about, oh, we need to increase government spending to stimulate the economy, right? Well, let's think about that. What is government spending? Well, as we've already established, the three ways that government spends all come from taxation. Okay, what is taxation? Taxation is the government taking a certain portion of the private sector's money for themselves. Okay, now let's set aside the ethics of it. Let's just assume that the ethics of it are fine. Okay, which they're not, but let's say they are. When the government then spends that money, people say, yes, the government has stimulated the economy. Well, it stimulated the economy relative to if it had taken that money and not spent it, right? Just kept it in a safe somewhere in a vault. Okay, but it hasn't stimulated the economy relative to if it hadn't taxed the money at all and allowed the private sector to invest in it. So in that sense, at the very least, it's a wash, right? It's like they cancel each other out. Okay, because either the private sector would have invested or the government would have invested it. If we assume they're both equally efficient, at best, you've cancelled each other out. But as we know, and as we'll talk about, I'm sure, over the coming weeks and months, the government isn't as efficient as the private sector because they can't be and because they don't have any incentive to be. So over time, government spending does the opposite of whatever stimulating is. It unstimulates the economy. I don't know if that's the right word. It destroys
capital.
It destroys, exactly. It destroys capital, great. Because at the very least, it has to pay for the wages of politicians. At the very least, some of that money is being spent on military spending, okay, which doesn't help to stimulate the local economy of your local hairdresser, okay? They're going to offshore to the fat cats that build nuclear weapons. Okay, so at the very least, that's happening.
The weapons companies. That's right.
Yeah, fucking Raycon and whatever else they're called.
Lockheed
those
Martin.
guys are making all the money, and it's all coming from your pocket at the end of the day. So no, government spending does not stimulate the economy, and we can get more into that as well and talk about the kinds of Keynesian lies about how yes, if you spend money, you raise aggregate demand and all that kind of stuff, which is all just nonsense. I'm sure we'll talk about that at a later date. But I think we've covered a lot in this first episode. I'm not going to lie. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on, Arabian, before we kind of wrap it up?
Man, yeah, no, great first episode, dude. And again, Aussie, like, so impressed with you, man. Like it's again, just such a white pill. It's so cool. Like, I think we were talking, over the last couple of days, and I was just saying to you how, like, it's like, I've never, being an Aussie, I've never ever in my life come across anybody who shares the same school of thought and understands these fundamental things, Austrian economics and the school of the philosophy of libertarianism. So it's so cool, man. It's so encouraging to have met you, to be able to do this podcast with you.
Man, I'm super excited for it. Super excited for it.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, it's great to come across someone in Australia who thinks the way I do, because they're rare. They're very rare people that have got the understanding of the world that we do. So it's super beneficial. I think it's going to be great over the next few weeks and coming months, hopefully.
And one other thing, sorry to cut you off there, but one other thing I just wanted to say in regards to government spending, which I can't remember who said this, but I heard it somewhere that, like, for politicians, right? And this is the point why the private sector is, more efficient, vastly more efficient than the public sector and government spending and programs, is that government and politicians don't have any skin in the game. Like, the money, like, it's easy to spend someone else's money and make promises with someone else's money, whereas a private actor, and let's be real, dude, like, when we talk about the market or the private sector, we're just talking about people. Like, that's something that I think gets lost. And dude, like, it's something for me, like, with my left-wing upbringing, I'm constantly, like, I had, and I think I said this to you the other day, like, I really, it was such a struggle for me to, like, unlearn all the fallacies that I had believed my whole life. damn, I lost my train of thought. Where was I going?
No, that's all right.
But yeah, but so like, you know, yeah, that's what I was saying, that the market, like when we talk about the market or, you know, the private sector, like it's we're talking about people, we're talking about real human beings, you know,
That's
like
it.
yeah, and like I just think that like for that's what I was getting at, is that like lefties, when they hear us talk about the market or the private sector, like it's almost like something that's demonized. Like they're like, oh, you know, they just think of like, I don't know, like fat cats, you know, Scrooge McDuck or something like that, you know, like oil companies, you know what I mean? But no, man, like it's everyday, like, you know, the mum and pop shop down the road in your country town serving, you know, toasty sandwiches and coffee. Like that's the private sector, you know what I mean? Like, and so a private actor with skin in the game who's investing their own money has, you know, is going to be like, what's the word, like you know, they're going to be more diligent with how they invest it and really weighing up the risks and making sure that it's, you know, as best that they can, that it's going to be a viable option. Whereas, you know, like when you with these politicians and the way that they spend and these sort of, you know, programs and stuff, like it's not their money, they don't have skin in the game, and at the end of the day, like again, like, and I think we'll probably talk about this in a later episode, that like what are the incentives, right? And for a politician, the incentives is to just get votes and to consolidate more power. And how do you do that? Well, you know, like just make promises that you can't keep, but who cares? Because, you know, they have all this power and yeah, they wield it.
Well, I think that's a good note to leave off on. A bit of a red pill for all of our listeners. Thank you so much if you're tuning into this very first episode. Plenty more to come. Really looking forward to it. But take care, guys. All the best.